Okay, so today we're starting 5.3 retrieval. The objective for today is to describe the strategies for retrieving memories. So once the memories have been encoded and stored, how do we retrieve them from your long-term memory? So there's 3 ways that we do this. The first is recall, and that is the ability to retrieve information. So that's the retrieve information is the key word here. Think about a fill-in-the-blank type test. The second is recognizing the person can identify items previously learned. Think about a multiple choice type test. And the third part of retrieval is what we call relearning. And this is the amount of time saved when relearning occurs. So the first time it may take you 30 minutes, but the second time it may only take you 15 minutes. Another way to retrieve information is priming. So this is a way to retrieve memories that have been stored. And what priming does is it activates what we call retrieval cues. And retrieval cues is the activation of associations and memory. So, one example of priming we have right here. Seeing or hearing the word rabbit. This is the activation or the priming. Because what we end up doing after we activate, we then visualize an actual rabbit. And then when we are asked to spell the word hare, we spell it as a rabbit hare, H-A-R-E, instead of like hair on your head. Because we've primed somebody to think that we're talking about a rabbit, not the hair on the head. In addition to priming and recalling information, we have found that the context that you are in, so the environment, the state of mind that you're in, can impact recall. So the context can impact your recall or retrieval. So the first kind of recall or context effect is what we call state-dependent memory. And this is like, an example would be when you're drunk or high. You want to be in the same state, the same mental state, right? So even you could talk about even caffeine would be an example. Another type of context dependent is the actual context, the same context. So the same room or environment. And what we see here is an example of context memory, right? So there's a greater recall in learning and testing contexts that in contexts were the same. So what we found is that if you learned the words in the water and land and then recalled them in the land and the water, you only recalled about 20% of the words. Whereas if you learned them in the water and then recalled them in the water, you remembered 30% of the words. And if you learned them in the land and then had to recall them on the land, you learned 40% of the words. So that being in the same context can, in fact, improve your memory. So ideally, we would like to test you for the AP exam in the class you learn the material. And then the final type is what we call mood congruent memory, and this is like the same mood, so happy or depressed. If you're happy when you have to recall, you're more likely to recall. If you're depressed when you have to recall, you're more likely to recall. Another type of retrieval error can be in what we call encoding failure. And what happens with encoding failure is we don't notice it, so it never gets encoded, or we don't encode properly. Now, one thing we do know is that this does impact, or age does impact it. So the older you get, the more encoding failures. This is why, Mrs. Cesario, needs you to write everything down. So you understand the sensory processes, you pay attention to it, so then it goes into working short-term memory, and then for whatever reason, it never makes it into long-term memory, probably because you got distracted by something else, and so therefore it didn't get encoded. Now, sometimes things get encoded, but they still deteriorate away, and this is what we call the storage decay, or the Ebbinghaus curve. And so what happens here is you learn the information, but then within the first few days, you forget almost half of that information, and then it kind of levels off. So the idea of the storage decay is that after the first few days, you forget half of information. Okay, so there is another problem when it comes to retrieval, and that's retrieval failure, meaning that you did store the information in your long-term memory, but you're having difficulty retrieving it out of long-term memory. And this happens for two reasons. The first could be proactive interference, and that's where old information impacts new information. So an example of this would be, let's say a phone number, right? So an old phone number impacts or interferes with learning a new phone number. Retro interference is the exact opposite, where new information is going to impact the old information. So let's say a friend gave me their locker combination to get something out of their locker. Then I go back to my locker later that day, and I can't remember my combo. That would be retroactive interference. Now, one way to remember this is actually with porn, right? So porn is going to be proactive, old information. So the old information is impacting the learning of the new information, where you have retroactive, the new information is impacting. So another little mnemonic device to help remember that.